Well, hello and welcome to this latest video in the Going Deeper series, where we're following up on the talks given for the Sunday meetings, just exploring things a little bit further, going over some of the things that have been said and perhaps looking at things in a slightly different way. And today I'm going to be looking again at the story found in John chapter 5, the healing of the man at the Pool of Bethesda. So the first thing to say is that if you've not yet heard that talk that I gave, then I suggest you go away and find one of the videos of that and go and listen to that first, because that will make this video make a lot more sense. So I'll just wait for you to go and do that. Right, hopefully everyone here now has watched that video, listened to that talk. So the first question that I asked myself and I want to raise here is, why did John put this miracle into his gospel? John himself says that he didn't include all the stories, and that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, none of the gospel writers could have included every single healing story in detail. In other places, we just read Jesus stayed somewhere for a certain amount of time and healed everyone who came to him. We don't get the whole story about everyone. So there is selection taking place in all of the Gospels. In John's Gospel, perhaps more than any of the others, his kind of outline plan, the structure, is a little bit more transparent. He actually says up front, the beginning of the gospel, with the first two miracles that we've looked at, this was the first sign, this was the second sign, and he leaves it up to us to work out what the rest of the signs are. But clearly he is saying, I'm putting these things here for a reason. So what was the reason for this miracle being included? Well, the general reason for John including things, he makes clear in chapter 20, right towards the back end of the gospel, when he says this: the disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. Hey guys, I couldn't include everything, but these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. So that's why John includes the things he does. He wants to tell us who Jesus is, and he wants to tell us what that means for us in terms of the new life that we can have in him. And that's why, if you haven't yet worked it out, we called this whole series Signs of New Life. It's not because we were sort of heading towards spring, although that's a happy coincidence, but it is to do with the new life that we can have in him. So what is it about this story that shows us particular things about Jesus and the life that we have in him? That's the first question I asked myself, and I'm raising again here. Well, first and most obviously, it's an amazing healing. Jesus heals this man who's been waiting around by this pool, which is somewhere that people thought that they could get healing. He's been waiting there not for a day or a week or a month. He's been waiting there for 38 years. Just let that sink in for a moment. Actually, how long this guy's been waiting and how long this guy has been disappointed. This is not someone with a bad back, going forward in a meeting. Oh, my back felt a bit sore today, so I'd like to come forward for healing. This is someone who's been seriously incapacitated for the larger proportion of his life. And yet, just a few words from Jesus, the guy is up, he's standing, he's walking around, and somewhat controversially, as it turns out, he's carrying his bedroll. It's an amazing stuff in and of itself. And in the discussion that follows afterwards with some of the Jewish leaders, Jesus makes it really clear where his authority for performing this and for performing this miracle on a Sabbath day, where that authority comes from. Verse 16 says this: "So the Jewish leaders began harassing Jesus for breaking the Sabbath rules. But Jesus replied, 'My Father,'" note those words, "'is always working, and so am I.'" So the Jewish leaders tried all the harder to find a way to kill him, for he not only broke the Sabbath, he called God his Father, thereby making himself equal with God. Now, sitting here, we are so used in our culture, even if people aren't Christians, that they're familiar, somewhat familiar with these words. We're familiar with the opening words of what we call the Lord's Prayer, which are, of course, "Our Father." Now, Jesus taught that prayer for a reason. He taught it because of the relationship he was telling his disciples and telling us we can have with God. But for the people listening to Jesus on that day that we've just been reading about in John 5, that was revolutionary and really verging on the blasphemous, if not blasphemous. You see, having a familial relationship with God was something that people could see for the nation. And for example, the prophet Hosea talks about God being like a husband who has an unfaithful wife, and the wife is the nation. So we've got this husband and wife relationship. It was acceptable to talk about God being the father of the nation, but for someone to claim that they had that personal relationship with God of father and son, that was something that, well, as we heard there, it caused a lot of a stir. And yet it was something that Jesus had kind of referenced earlier, wasn't it? In John 3, that amazingly famous verse, Jesus talks about being born again. And when you are born again into a family. And he was making clear that just as he had this special relationship with his Father, so too he was making sonship possible and a membership of God's family possible to people on a personal level in this new life. So that's the first thing. It's important because of the controversy, that the story is important because of the controversy that it stirred up, and then how Jesus explained what he'd done. And if you've listened to the talk, you'll be aware that in preparing my talk, and as I read the passage over and over again, which is what I do, there was this phrase that I repeated in the talk as what I saw as a kind of a central theme, central thread running through the story. It really impressed itself upon me. And the phrase was this: law looks at the problem, love looks at the answer. And this kind of contrast between law as it's represented in what we read in this story and love in terms of how we see Jesus responding, this amazing contrast between these two really stood out to me. And of course it's illustrated most vividly in the contrast between how Jesus viewed the viability of healing someone on the Sabbath day. He got on and did it. And how the Jewish leaders responded in their legalistic way, looking at the actions of this miraculously healed man and criticising those actions because he was technically performing work by carrying his bedroll. And as I said in the talk, it's almost a caricature. It's almost something out of a sitcom. So far are those two things removed from each other in terms of attitude. But this principle of law and problem, love and answer, I think does permeate the whole story. And an aspect of this, I think, that it brings out, which I kind of referenced very quickly in the talk, but I think it really brings out the difference between being judgmental and then the loving judgment which Jesus said had been entrusted to him by his Father. So how does that work out? Well, okay. First of all, again, let's just look at the context and something that spoke to me. The Pool of Bethesda may well have been, it was, scholars tell us, a popular, well-known place of healing. But how would we, if we're honest, regard it today? And as I said, it all sounds a little bit freaky-deaky with the waters of the pool bubbling up because an angel's disturbed it. And I do wonder if we would see it as a place of superstition, a place tainted with association with pagan deities. Apparently scholars tell us there was that as well. And the more I thought about it, and forgive me if this is just me, I've not read this anywhere else, but to me it sounded more and more like the sort of place that in the past, in my early Christian life, I was taught to avoid such places of superstition, and unless in case they sort of led me astray. And yet the truth is, this was a place that people came to find answers to their problems. And the truth was that in many cases, certainly in the case of this guy, they were looking for answers, but they ended up in disappointment. And so I asked myself the question, and this was something that spoke to me, maybe it will speak to you, where would be those places today? Places that people are going to, albeit misguidedly, but they are genuinely looking for answers in life. And how can I respond to the call to be like Jesus in such places? Asking questions, Jesus asked questions there, but also being able, in a non-judgmental way, to offer real answers. Now, if that does speak to you, there will be different places that will be coming to mind for each one of us, but it is perhaps worth asking our Heavenly Father the question, as Jesus obviously did, where are you working in such places, Father, and where and how do you want me to join in? Moving on, how do we regard the man who is healed? Are our sympathies entirely with him, or is there a bit of us that's kind of saying, well, he's been there a very long time, and has he really done everything that he could do for himself? And surely, something else could have happened, and has he just got used to begging and relying on other people and all of this stuff? Jesus does ask him, do you really want to be healed? But also, challengingly, even though the guy's answer to me sounds less than perfect, Jesus looks into his heart. I think that's the issue, really, and sees that, yes, he really does want to be healed. There is a genuine desire in his heart for that. Now, I made a brief reference in the talk. Yeah, I told you it would make sense if you listen to the talk. I made a brief reference in the talk to work I've been involved in developing nations. Let me just explain that a little bit, because I think it does have wider application. It is often daunting when you have the opportunity to go to some of these places and see firsthand the scale of the problem. It can be totally overwhelming, and you can be made very, very aware of how little it is that you kind of have to offer, certainly materially. And it's really difficult when someone asks you for help, and then you aren't sure, is this someone who's going to squander that help, squander those limited resources? Are they just going to sort of take advantage of that and then wait for the next handout? And you end up with a sort of an inner battle. I did anyway, and I've spoken to other people who experience similar things, where it's very easy to end up being cynical and always to doubt people's motivation and intentions. But, that's really vivid in those situations. But, that can be true in everyday life, can't it? We can end up kind of being cynical about people. And can you really trust people? Do they really mean that? Are they genuine? And maybe the question we should be asking again is going to our Father and saying, Father, you know their heart. Help me to see their heart. And in seeing that, what do you want me to do about that? And following on from that, Jesus' final interaction with the man again shows this difference between being judgmental and loving judgment, if I can put it like that. Now, Jesus knows that the man could easily end up in a worse state than he started out. Now, that could mean that in some way Jesus knows the guy's state was due to sin. There are consequences to doing things that are wrong. Physically, that we can bring things on ourselves in our bodies. I don't think Jesus was being judgmental in that. Maybe he was just simply saying, look, you've been very limited in what you could do for the last 38 years. You've now got all sorts of possibilities. There could be problems associated with that. Jesus has certainly earned the right for the man to give him attention. He's met the guy's needs first, before anything else. And there weren't any strings attached to that. He has gone to the man after that, I think, now wanting to continue to see the healing worked out and health to be worked out and the very best for the man realised. I don't think there's any condemnation, but Jesus says to him, not to sin. He speaks his truth in love, but he speaks it clearly. He says, do not sin. It's the same words that he says to the woman caught in adultery a little bit later on. No condemnation, but truth that wants the best for the person and wants to draw out their potential. Now, I find that balance really hard. I find it really hard to imagine sometimes myself saying things to people with that amount of clarity without causing offence. But Jesus somehow managed to get that balance, didn't he? And I just think that's something we should pursue. For those of you that have heard of this, that's why I love the Heart Stars tool, because I think it gives us a context and a language to have those sorts of conversations. But however we do it, let's make sure we do it in a positive way. Jesus certainly did. The world has got enough judgmental people. And sadly, it seems to me, and I hope this also isn't falling into being judgmental, some of those are people who are professing Christians and writing things on Facebook and other social media. Chris Valentin, who's a leader from the Bethel Church in California, recently wrote in his Facebook feed, "What if we just loved people without an agenda? I mean, we had no other motive except loving them. What if loving them wasn't part of a bigger plan or a grander scheme? What if it was simply for them to experience the love of God without any strings attached?" Well, that sounds good to me. So, just finishing up, there we've got this story of amazing healing that doesn't just show miraculous power, but I think also speaks to us about our attitudes in our new life and the way we regard people. It speaks to us about living by love, not law, and about listening to our Heavenly Father and joining in with the work He is doing, even if that's in unlikely places. Perhaps especially if that's in unlikely places.